Hello everyone and welcome to the 1-3 review video. Remember, this may look familiar. This is from the preview video, but we're talking about how we define nature, wilderness, and pastoralism differently, perhaps in each of these authors. Remember that pastoralism is the idea that country life is somehow, in any number of ways, better than city life. It's an ancient tradition. You can find it going back to, say, Greek literature or something like this, and we can find it in other cultures as well. In the modern sense, it's the idea or need to disengage from the complexity of modern life, to disengage from the dominant culture, to seek the basis for a simpler, more harmonious way of life. Right, and that's been around since really the mid-19th century. You might kind of connect this to. That's what Leo Marx, the scholar whom this book comes from, was writing about mid-19th century literature. All right, so otherwise, what else is going on? These are the things that are going on, but what I'd like to do is move to our readings. So here are our reading questions. Basically, I asked you to go through, make sure you understand the she's reading. And remember, the big part of the she's reading is knowing this right here, as well as a few other ideas. What is the pastoral? Knowing some of these basic binaries, civilization versus wilderness, city versus country, the light and dark, right? Maybe the rawness of nature as the darkness. And also that it's not just the country, but it's rural versus wilderness. They're very, very different. That leads us down to the soft pastoral, probably more rural, where people are living, it's cultivated. There's some harmony there, versus a hard pastoral, which is unreachable, and maybe that's what makes it sublime. Or maybe it's something that's so raw that it will overcome us. If you remember that picture by Turner, the oil painting by Turner, of basically the giant wave about to sweep away the lighthouse, we might think of that as hard pastoral, right? And so that's what we're dealing with today. D2 Outposts captured some of those ideas from She's, the grid on page 5, etc. I think we're in pretty good shape, and you should have a good understanding for any exams and just a good understanding of ideas in general. Thoreau is alive and writing in basically the mid-19th century, we can say, if we want to place him generally. A few things that come up in the bio that are worth noting is that he was a longtime member of the Transcendental Club. You can see the Transcendental movement, or this club. It's a broader movement we refer to now in history. It's sort of the same as, even though it happens just a bit later, the Romantic movement from England, which started more in the late 1700s and is still continuing at this time. But if they're generally the same, and we'll read some Wordsworth eventually, and he's a English romantic. This is an easy way to describe this to ourselves, is to think that, okay, they were seeking some sort of community with nature, some sort of commune with nature, some sort of spiritual existence, and they were breaking away from, again, sort of, we could say, just general Christian attitudes toward nature, about where beauty comes from. You'll notice there's plenty of references to God from transcendentals, and you'll even see some from Thoreau. We can see that right down here, this quote that he gave when he was dying. Someone asked him if he had made peace with God. I didn't know we had ever quarreled. So clearly there's a belief in God and something bigger, but it's also a certain set of beliefs and assumptions about nature that are changed from, say, the Adam and Eve readings, right? Not about domination of nature anymore, if that was ever the message, the ancient message. Now we can see that they're reinventing what we are supposed to feel from God's given world. That means, though, that it might come up short in its ecological thinking. There's something of the scientist and something of the religionist in Thoreau, and that's probably a good way to think of this period, and to begin to evaluate just how ecological are they. Would their ideas stand up in the modern day, scientifically speaking, or are they still just great proponents and reflectors upon nature that make us really appreciate nature, even if they aren't, say, scientifically accurate, or we don't see them as activists or something like this. Looking at probably in all the questions, we can see that here. I'm asking you what you liked. What do you think he values in nature? Why is it best used? What's the ideal relationship? And then again, what are any shortcomings? So that's always a good way to read these, to say, like, well, they're doing all these really nice things, but what are they not doing yet that maybe they could be doing? Or you could just see that as sort of a compare-contrast. Is there another author that did something positive that this author, in this case Thoreau, did not do? And that's a great way to read these texts against each other in some way. Here are some general insights on Thoreau that'll help guide our reading and kind of help us pinpoint what he's doing. He's definitely a soft pastoralist. He's living just outside of town. There's a lot of human activity around, and he's living in communion with nature. Nature versus civilization. He's definitely got some of this theme going on. You probably caught moments where he's talking about human activities as confused, right? We're always building things and developing and progressing. There's that progress narrative that kicked in the Industrial Revolution for sure. And he's not a big proponent of that. He doesn't say awful things about it, but he says that people are confused because they're not over here appreciating nature, right? There's a certain unconsciousness in Thoreau versus the self-consciousness of urban progress and developing technology. We see him commenting on that. And there's some appreciation for Native American previous cultures as well. So he's not just interested in American histories and Americans showing up to dominate the land or to make it a new land or something like this, but he appreciates the timelessness and that other people have lived here, other civilizations have been here before him. So his appreciation for people and other civilizations, but also for the land itself and the timelessness of the land, right? And that connects him to some anti-modernism as well, especially nature versus civilization. So let's take a look at a few. You might have caught in one section, I love this one, the very first entry. He really is looking at ecology here, how things die away to the ground, leaving behind all of these things and rotting, and the next thing comes up. Notice that he sees a lot of energy. It will impart a vigorous life to an infant forest, right? And so he really sees, he uses a lot of the language of the progressions of life and energy, and these are some of his major metaphors that he uses. So his writing tends to be really energetic in his writing. We'll see that in the next one as well. The first paragraph captures sort of the energy of life, and that one thing passes to the next and builds the next or grows the next. We really see him being a good environmentalist here and thinking, well, wait a minute, whatever I grow is going to affect the next generation. And he's not talking people here, of course. He's actually thinking about what's going to grow here, right? If I grow pines and birches, my virgin mold will not sustain the oak, but pines and birches, or perchance weeds and brambles. And so he's really thinking about the land and how we treat the land. This is an early environmental moment that's really nicely done. If I plant certain things, only certain things will grow back, and I've got to be careful about the environment that I create. He sees humans in charge of the environment here. And the weeds and the brambles is literal, but also a nice metaphor that if we don't take care of the environment, we'll be left with nothing but weeds and brambles, right? So that's a good insight as well. Maybe a comment more on how we treat nature. If we want to keep going from here, I like the second one as well, the second entry. He's reflecting on the dynamism and the chaos that would, cause confusion elsewhere, but in nature, this is some of the beauty of nature. He's basically saying, how can we not appreciate all of this, again, the energy and the dynamism and even the conflict of nature, right? Interesting moments takes place at the top of the next page, still in that same second entry. He's commenting on society when he says it's now ironically called silence audible, all of this chaos of nature, right? And so silence audible is a comment that we've created this really busy world that is a completely different type of noise than the more productive noise of nature, right? And we can see that he's getting into his first commentary on civilization, and that he doesn't always like it and finds us confused. He calls it confusion here. And above all, the incessant tinkering named the hum of industry, right? He calls it, here's the passage I was thinking of, the hurrying to and fro of confused, jabbering men, right? So we can really see him commenting on, and not that we're living horribly wrong, but that we are confused. We're paying attention to the wrong things. What else might we say about this to close this down and connect it back to some course ideas? This is the pastoral. It's the soft pastoral, right? It's not about the rawness of nature, but rather it is the celebration of quiet country life over the fallen cities. If we want to connect it back to the fall, right? We've caused the fall, all this technology. And we see the progress recovery narrative there too. This is considered progress, but really for him it's just confusion. So we can see some of those older course ideas coming in as well. So to this extent, the countryside is the new Eden, right? And so we see some of that stuff from Module 1 coming back up again, and it certainly applies here. Let's look at the steamship entry. I think that'll be interesting for us. Get more commentary from steamships here, this passage. It opens up with a few lines showing that we have humans creating technology. And it doesn't seem bad, at least there's no negative assessment of it right away. However, it seems to be sort of a waste of time, or it's just something that's happening and is no more important, maybe that's the right way to phrase it, no more important than what nature is doing at the same time. And notice that nature is indifferent to humans, right? That's important too. So either nature is more important, or at least it's equally important to humankind. And we can see that right here. And some other things we might say about this that I jotted down in the notes that might be useful to think of. In some ways, this is similar to Silent Spring, that humans and nature each have their own pace. In Thoreau, each is separate from each other and doesn't affect the other. So we can think of that as some pastoralism, of course, too. And in Silent Spring, we saw that humans can no longer think of their industrial creations as separate from the environment. So this is an interesting moment, too. At this point in time, we can still keep things separate and say that, okay, well, there's people and there's nature, and they're not really going to bother each other too much. Nature can just kind of ignore this, and there's no effect, right? But, 100 years later, or near 100 years later, we can't say that anymore. And Silent Spring is the book that breaks all that open, right? So we can see where things are going historically. It's hard to maintain this easy division that we get in 1838 by the time it is the 1960s. All right, if we want to take a look at page 6, we'll look at Thoreau a little bit more here. What might we say about this passage here? Just to give you a little bit different theme that comes out of Thoreau. Page 6, this is where the tree is being cut down. I really like this passage too. One thing to note here is that it's described the tree is described in almost a heroic or majestic manner. One of my favorite moments is when it's supposed to fall. I expect its crashing fall. But I'm mistaken, it hasn't moved an inch. It stands at the same angle as at the first. It's 15 minutes and yet it hasn't fallen, right? So the tree, the way it's described by Thoreau is that the tree is resisting the human activities to knock it down. Now, it might have really happened that way, but notice the framing too, that as a writer, he's trying to make it seem again like human activities can't fell the awesomeness or the rawness of nature, this giant of nature, right? The power of nature. He even personifies nature. Eventually it does crash down and he gives us this line, not even trees, and it falls on some rocks, right? And he says, not even trees die without a groan. So he's really making us feel sorry for this tree. First he builds it up and makes us feel positive emotions by describing its majesty in this passage up here. And then toward the end, he makes us see it as dying the way that humans die. All right, let's next talk about Teddy Roosevelt, former President Teddy Roosevelt. Remember that one of his major contributions, he was sort of in a network of what we might call environmentalists, people concerned with the environment. And because of his presidency, had a lot of power to actually preserve nature, and much of the land that we now call the national parks we can trace more or less directly back to him and his ideas, and including the ideas in these letters, right? So let's talk about the Chapman letter. I'm just going to take you through my notes. I'll make a few references to lines here as well, but we're running low on time. So the to Chapman letter, notice it's a letter to the Audubon Society, which is a nature preservation society that was active at this time, probably the major one in America at this time. Notice that it discusses the protection of animals. So this is the first time we've seen something like law or policy or something like this enter, and probably again because of the politics of being president, right, and his ability to do these things, or he's interested in these things, and he is heavily connected to the political world even before his presidency. So a few things that are interesting to note if we actually look at the language here and look at how Teddy Roosevelt might be different than Thoreau. He says the bluebird's loss was like an old friend down in here, right? So he also says on the next page, a disappearing species is like the loss of a writer's greatest works. He says that right here, right? So that's really interesting in the language he's chosen to describe the loss. Clearly he's an environmentalist, but he's using things that are very, very human, and that are very, very cultural. While we could see that as good, we could see that as a bit of distance between his ecological thinking and his appreciation of nature. And so we're about out of time in this video. I'll make a short video to follow up where we go a little bit farther, looking at Roosevelt and at Aldo Leopold. Thank you.